All right, so we're going to do the notes for vehicle emissions. So that's our title. Get your notes out. Oops. All right, vehicle emissions. Here we go. So first off, different types of vehicles have different emissions of pollutants. So all of our combustion engines create pollutants and put them out into the atmosphere via our tailpipe. We have different parts to our cars that are supposed to filter that out, but we still emit quite a bit of pollution, okay? And no vehicle that is motorized is completely emission-free for air pollutants. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more later, but there are no vehicles that are motorized that are completely emission-free. So if you're in your brain thinking that there is one, hopefully we'll cover that, and if not, you can send me an email. We can talk about it. Okay, so we're going to go through some major categories of vehicles, starting with things that are more common and working towards things that are less common, especially in Wyoming, okay? So first, we'll just start with diesel. Okay. All right, diesel produces CO2, so carbon dioxide, as it burns fuel. Okay, so produces CO2 as it burns fuel. Diesel vehicles produce 20 times higher amounts of nitrogen oxides. Okay, 20 times higher amounts of nitrogen oxides when compared to other vehicles. Okay. Diesel vehicles produce 28 times higher amounts of, lower amounts, sorry if you already wrote that. For 28 times lower amounts of carbon monoxide. Okay. And they produce significantly higher sulfur oxides and aerosols. Okay, remember we're going to define aerosols again here, but this is an important word for you to know for air pollution. Aerosols are solid particles suspended in the air. So it's much more common to see a diesel vehicle produce a cloud of black smoke coming out of the tailpipe than it is for a gasoline vehicle, for example. So significantly higher aerosols and sulfur oxides because diesel has a higher sulfur content than gasoline. Okay, so let's just go into gasoline next. So gasoline vehicles, they also produce CO2 as they burn fuel. So I'm just going to copy this sentence up here. Produces CO2 as it burns fuel. Produces 20 times fewer nitrogen oxides. I'm just going to do NOx since we already wrote the name above. Produces 28 times higher carbon monoxide. So gasoline creates a lot more carbon monoxide than diesel. And produces only traces of sulfur oxides and very little aerosols. Okay, especially if the vehicle is running well. okay? Okay, so that's gasoline. Now we're gonna go into hybrid. So remember, hybrid means to mix. So a hybrid vehicle is a mixture of gasoline and electric, okay? So mixture of gasoline power and electric power. Okay, here's what we have for vehicles, for hybrid vehicles, okay? All tailpipe emissions are reduced because less fuel is burned. Okay, so because we're using electricity for part of the power, there's less gasoline used, which means that everything that would normally come out of the tailpipe is going to be less now because we're using that electricity. But we have to think about where that electricity comes from, okay? So emissions should be counted from the power source. Okay, so like for example, the power plant that produced the electricity for the charging of the vehicle, okay, the power plant that produced the electricity for the charging of the vehicle most likely released air pollutants when it was making that electricity. Most likely released air pollutants when it was making that electricity. Okay, so you can't say it's emission free if the power that it has is coming from something that's creating emissions, right? Okay, next we'll go to all electric, and this is going to be similar. So electric vehicles, so no gasoline at all, just electric, okay? They have 0 tailpipe emissions. So they're not making CO2, nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxides, carbon monoxide, aerosols, nothing. There's no tailpipe on an electric vehicle, so no tailpipe emissions, okay? But just like with the hybrid, emissions should be counted from the power source. So whatever's charging that vehicle, that electricity came from somewhere, and what kind of emissions were produced when that electricity was made. Okay, so you have to consider that. All right, and then finally, a category of vehicle that's super rare in Wyoming. It is common, starting to be a little bit more common in large cities in California, but this would be a hydrogen vehicle. Okay, so hydrogen is a gas and it's flammable and it can be used to make a combustion engine. There's a lot of danger associated with that. You have to have a lot of safety protocols because hydrogen can be pretty explosive. But we'll just talk about these vehicles real quick. They produce water as they burn hydrogen. So what comes out of their tailpipe is water, okay? No tailpipe emissions of pollutants. They just, again, just make water, which is kind of cool. They have no power source emissions because they aren't electric, so they're not creating emissions via electricity, okay? The emissions from the factory that made the car and however the hydrogen is produced would be the only emissions for this vehicle. Okay, so it depends. It really depends how that hydrogen is made, whether there's emissions associated with that. The factory that makes the car is always going to have emissions. And so, I mean, you could say any vehicle is not emission-free, even a bicycle, because somewhere someone had to make it, and making that is going to have an energy cost associated with it, and that's going to be creating emissions. So anyway, but hydrogen vehicle is as close as it gets for cars to having no emissions. And that, I believe, yep, is the end of our vehicle emission notes. Thanks, everyone.